in. Perfect. So as I've mentioned before, there are many ways for us to interact and engage with us. So if this is the first time you are on Zoom, feel free to take a look at the menu bar there. We have our chat. The private message function is also on. So if you feel resonated with some other person's thoughts or what they have shared, feel free to reach out to them and connect with them. There's also the reactions button for nonverbal communication. So if you feel like you've really resonated with some of the stuff that we've said, we'd love to see you show us some of the reactions that you're feeling right now as well. So this session is brought to you by partnership by OECM in partnership with Dell Technologies and ALP Advanced Learning Partnerships. These sessions are essentially designed in consultation with Ontario educators such as myself and Inial. This is one of many offerings that have been curated and selected to support educators in pursuit of the 3 ministry goals of achieving excellence, social and emotional learning, and equity and inclusion. So in addition to our sessions, there are also plenty of other sessions. So we encourage you to check them out as well. I know that that Bitly link is not a link, but you can just feel free to copy that in and just make sure you register for the other sessions as well.
And Isabella Katina is here, so I wonder if she has any words to add or anything that she wanted to share at this point. Hi, Katina. Good evening.
Hi, good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to see you all, and we're so excited to have our sessions back. We took a little bit of a break over the holidays, which was well needed. So I would like to welcome everybody and bring our regards from both Dell Technologies as well as ALP and OECM. They're our hosts for this evening, and we really appreciate you coming out and supporting the group here. Fantastic leaders for all of these sessions and many more to come. I am going to have to step away from this session. I will be watching the recording, but I do want to let people know there will be a prize at the end, and I'll leave it up to the host to figure out how to deliver that prize. But I'll just need email and a phone number. But I'll leave that to you folks. Have a wonderful session and all the best. Thank you.
Thanks, Katina.
Thank you. So before we start, we wanted to just acknowledge the land that we're in. As Inial and I are from Toronto, we would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Wendat, the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Métis, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to learn, live, and work on this land. So when I think about making acknowledgements, I think about my relationship with the land. While we all have different identities ourselves, whether it be First generation, immigrants, residents, citizens, we're all essentially settlers. So when I acknowledge the land that we're on, I think about the people that I had the privilege to connect, to learn, to know. They remind me of how important connections are to people, community, and land, and how vital it is to building strong relationships with those around you. So as we take the time to reflect, I really want to encourage you to take the time to reflect and think about the relationships that you have in a classroom, to the land, and also to the Indigenous communities in your area. What can you do to rebuild the trust with the land and the communities that serve it, and in particular, the Indigenous communities? So a little bit about myself, I'm Isabella. My pronouns are she, her. I also go by the pronouns they, them. And I am a high school science and chemistry teacher. I also wear many hats. So in addition to being a classroom teacher, I'm also the EdTech integration director at our school. So I'm also supporting my staff into, leveraging the digital technologies that we have available so that they can become the best teachers that they are already. And obviously with the pandemic, a lot of us have had to rely quite heavily on the tech. And we're going to discuss a little bit on the equity issue that's related to tech as well in our sessions here. So I'm going to pass it on to Inial, and she's going to introduce herself.
Welcome, everyone. It's so good to see faces from near and far. My name is Inial Inparaja, and I use the pronouns she, her. I'm a settler on this land, immigrated to Canada when I was 11 years old. And I wanted to use this platform, this moment, to share that the recent events in Ottawa has resurfaced conversations that I used to have with my dad when I was 11 years old, and conversations now I find that I'm having with my 9-year-old son. So as a classroom educator and as an administrator, I think that it has always been very critical and crucial for me to teach and learn alongside students, families about injustices, and educators about injustices, and create brave environments that promote inclusion. Currently, I am on secondment from the Toronto District School Board, the board that I am and have been for the past 20 years. And I see some amazing colleagues here with me sharing this space. I'm very grateful. And currently, I'm an instructional liaison with TBO. In the chat, we want you to please maybe share the name that you want to be recognized by today, as well as a decision that you made today that was based on data. So, for me, the decision that I made that was based on data was to continue playing Wordle. And, I've been tracking sort of my attempt scores over the recent week that I've sort of gotten into it. And so that was the decision that I made this morning, was to play the Wordle based on data and based on my attempt score. So really invite you to share your name that you want to be called by today, and a decision that you made, personal or professional, that was based on data. So we'd love to see some of that today.
So as you're taking the time to share with us in the chat, we just wanted to remind you that this is one of the 3 sessions that we're going to be talking about around data. So today we're essentially going to be setting our tone, and we're really grounding ourselves with this book, Street Data. So if you haven't had a chance to take a look at it, we strongly encourage you to do that. It's really opened my eyes to how I'm really approaching data as an educator. And essentially, we're just going to be talking about those 3 major questions. What is data? What type of data do we use? And what type of data do we collect as educators? And how can we use that data to create a holistic picture of the story? And then, oh, sorry, I don't know if I wanted to talk about
just some really good stuff coming in.
No.
Getting caught by a drone.
Me too.
It's around weather, to get more movement. Yes, that's right. Good one. Thank you, Mafusa. I'm very mindful of that during the day, especially now that I'm sitting more. And as an educator, I used to stand all the time. Yes, interesting. Thank you so much. Keep it going if you haven't shared yet.
Thank you. And we just wanted to also set our norms, borrowing George Singleton's Courageous Conversations. Again, fantastic book. On the 4 major pillars. So we really encourage you to stay engaged. Again, there are different ways for you to stay engaged. Type in the chat, use your reactions, unmute if you want. It is quite informal. So don't feel like you are interrupting us at any given point in time. If you wanted to just sort of voice something, speak your truth, really start from a position of your own personal experiences. And when we are sharing our own experiences and we're listening to other people's stories, we are going to acknowledge that there is going to be some kind of discomfort that's going to happen, and that's okay. So take the time to sit with that feeling and be okay with non-closure. So there's always going to be a right to pass when you're sharing with others. You can feel free to just be an active listener. So that's basically how we're going to be conducting our sessions from now until the end.
And because it's a very small group too, I think it's going to be great to have those dialogues as we move forward. So as Isabella and I bring to this particular topic really different perspectives on data and different educational context as well, depending on the educational space that we work in. So when we were really thinking and trying to plan for this particular session, we settled on these 2 questions in order to ground us and in order to just keep coming back to how we can kind of loop back to this particular question. How can data have the capacity to diagnose root causes of inequity? How might data have the potential to transform learning and the power to reshape outcomes? So diagnose root causes of inequity, transform learning, and the power to reshape outcomes. So during the session, think of they're broad, big questions, and just kind of refer back to it in order to pinpoint and to kind of form the foundation for it as well as we move along. So through our experiences, and for me, it's mostly been as an educator, I understood data as to be words, numbers, and observations. Most of you could maybe relate to that as well. So quite simply, it's information that is collected in an organized, systemic way, and used to make instructional or organizational decisions. And data can be quantitative or qualitative. And I find it interesting, actually, that quantitative data seems to have a higher level of acceptance. As long as you can show a percentage or a number or a ratio, it's taken differently than qualitative data. But I think it is changing as we move on in different circles. So I often wonder when I look at data, how is it collected? How accessible was the question? Who was asking the question? Whose voices are missing in the data? Who asked the question, and were they in a power position when they asked that question? And what is not told through the data that we're looking at? So if there are any questions that you often ask yourself when you look at data, we invite you to put it in the chat as well. So data for me is not, data itself is not the evidence. It's never enough, I found for myself, and I'm speaking from my experience. But it can be humanizing because it is coming from somebody. It's someone's answer and perspective. And it can be liberating, and it can be healing. And that is directly a statement from Street Data on page 19. The challenge I find lies in investigating the clues that the data gives us about the effectiveness of how it's being used, right? And revealing the underlying story behind the facts and figures. That's where the richness comes from. So data collection is necessary for educators, and I'm assuming that some of us are in the education field and others in other organizations, but it is a necessary part of educators' responsibilities to regularly use data to influence and inform our practices. And we live in a data culture. Data is everywhere. So much data is available. And whether or not we know what to do with it is another question entirely. And it can lead to overload and confusion. Like, which data do you use, when, and why? And so it is something to be able to kind of think about. The document that's listed there is quite a good one. It's a 2018 publication from the Ministry of Education. It's called Using Data, Transforming Potential to Practice. And there is lots of different frameworks on how to engage communities to look at and to create a culture around data in the learning spaces. It is a long one, but it is structured really well for you to take and use with the staff that you're serving.
So right now we really want to hear from you, because I think what Inial and I provide in terms of perspective is still uniquely our own. So we wanted to just see where everybody is in terms of what type of data do you gather and seek out. So I've pasted the link to a Jamboard there, so then you can just simply head on over there and then open up a new Post-it note and then just type out the answers there. And then Inial will be able to present and we can take it up together.
Great. We see lots of people on it already. We did make 2 slides just in case you run out of room. Feel free to use slide 2 as well. And just really curious to see, I always wonder, what do we have access to even? Sometimes there's data. I found that I didn't have access to a lot of data at certain points in my career, and then suddenly I had access to too much data. So.
So there's plenty of stuff that I can see that's been shared, and it's great. Some of the stuff I've also used, and then we can see that immediately there's a little bit of a distinction. There's definitely some data that is very tangible. We have a number or a letter that's associated to it, which is, attendance or their previous learning records, or even their Ontario student records. And then PISA scores or literacy scores, the EQAO scores. And there's also stuff that are kind of like, a little bit messier, student stories, their anecdotes, maybe parent stories, or even when I'm looking at lab exercises, I'm particularly looking at their soft skills, right? Like what are their motor skills when they're, doing a particular experiment? And those are really hard to sort of quantify or trying to measure that. And so how can we make sense of it all to create a whole picture of what's really happening in front of us? And so we're going to be going through a couple of frameworks. In the book, Street Data, it essentially breaks down data into 3 different categories. So just think of it as like a large funnel. Us as educators, we tend to really put a lot of emphasis on what's known as the satellite data. So in this table, it would be particularly in the student learning data. So we're really focusing on the grades, the graduation rates, all those numbered data, because we can hold on to that. We can make sense of the numbers. We're essentially, they're considered satellite data because we're essentially viewing the students and our school in a very far distance. We're looking at them like a satellite. And this essentially creates the test obsessed culture, a competition over community kind of culture, where the emphasis is placed on test preparation or university acceptances, and then the teacher's success or the teacher's value is based off of desirable results, which is whether the students have made it, especially in my context as a high school teacher. So in that book, essentially what they're trying to say is that us as educators, we're essentially measuring the wrong things, because when we're really only focusing on the marks, and I'm sure we've all experienced this in the last 2 years, is that we're seeing all those cracks right now. The numbers no longer make sense. When we're putting a grade to our learning skill that is only defined what it looks like in a student who's in the classroom, that learning skill does not look the same when now our students are online. So how can we measure engagement when it's clearly different when our students are in person versus online? And so what we really are trying to do as educators is that we want to measure our students' achievement and how they've achieved so far. And we want them to become successful human beings and to flourish in society. And so data collections should be holistic. So again, this is another framework here. When we're looking at our demographic, we should have our demographic data, we have our achievement, and also the perception. And the perception piece is what's really allowing us to sort of like connect the dots and fill in the gap and to have that whole picture. But realistically, if you look into the right-hand side, that's basically what our schools all look like. We have our demographic data, and then we have our school process and programs data, and that's it. So what's really missing is that perception piece. And that's the micro piece. That's our street data that we're really missing, because data should be collected from the ground level. It should be considered, through observations, through active listening, through various artifacts. And we're going to be talking a little bit on that as well.
So we have another little document here that we pulled from to preface the exploration into street data. And as you can see, the data that we have access to is used for a variety of reasons and purposes. And we have listed, these are directly from this ministry document called Using Data to Improve Student Achievement. It's a little bit dated. I mean, it's 2008, but there are some good pieces that you can pull out to use in your professional learning communities, or to create that data culture within your spaces as well. So looking at all of those, the list, I wonder, what does this bring up for you? What are your thoughts on this particular list in terms of how educators and learning spaces use data? We tend to think of data as information, right, as evidence-based. I used to use the term, and I still think I do, because it was totally brainwashed in me, evidence-based decisions, data-informed, data-driven. Like it was like a little puppet repeating these things. But I know for me, there was always a disconnect with that, So those looking at data see what the viewer wants to see. The viewer chooses the data based on what's valuable to them or to their community. This particular article states that some educators don't think the data that they have access to is useful at all, that they don't find it useful. It's lagging. EQAO data from last year used to then plan out things for standard. That's Brendan, that's the standardized test that we have here in Ontario. Used to plan for future, outcomes. Reading levels that are just collected, that is a number that's used to then, put in place strategies. So for me, there was always a disconnect. And the article states that there is a variation in thinking about data. Some educators find it useful, while others say it's not current and it doesn't align to the day-to-day happenings on the grassroots level, that in the classroom. So then it brings to mind, if the variation is then in how we conceptualize this data and how we value it based on our own individual assumptions and biases, then that's another layer to how we are interpreting the data that is available to us as well. So in both of these, in this article, it goes back to the educational context. So use the relevant data, and it has to be considered in each of the educational contexts. So it could be varied within the schools, within a network. It could be varied within the board. It could be varied. So what does that bring up for you? What are your thoughts on this in terms of the data informed, the data driven, the evidence based? What are the experiences that you have had looking at the data, and then maybe the disjoint that you're feeling?
Exactly. What stories is the data not telling? Yeah, that's definitely something that we also struggle with in our conversation, is how can you put lived experiences into paper, or in a form, like when you're collecting that data, like how can you contextualize it all? And how can you make sense of it? Because everybody has such complex histories. And how does that make any sense in a classroom? How is data sometimes leveraged to confirm biases? Exactly. And that's, yep, the way we ask our questions sometimes could be very leading. So it lends automatically to certain types of responses.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Thank you for your responses. So as I mentioned before, there's always been a disconnect for me with data. So in addition to using data in school improvement plans for, student well-being, equity, achievement, use of it something was always missing. And often the data that I was reading and interpreting was rooted in a deficit mindset. Which percentage can? Which percentage can't? Which student is achieving? Which student is not achieving? And I also found that there was a lag in terms of the data I was using and what I was, expected to do. So I think for me, I filled in the space. I filled in the space between the numbers with stories, with conversations, with dialogues, with students, with families, with educators. And that was the piece. That's the street level data bit that helped complement the satellite data, helped complement the map data. So I think that, the decisions that I was making as a classroom teacher or as an administrator had a point of impact because of the lived experiences, as you mentioned. Isabella, did you want to share some of your perspectives to that? Or maybe we can have
I think
anyone
we
else
can also let people dive deep into it.
Dive deep in. Okay.
We've been talking about this book forever.
We've been talking about the book. Yes, we have.
What are these different types of data? Yeah. So we're going to give you some time to sort of like digest and just really look at the different categories of data. So we have our satellite, which is the data that we are very familiar with. And then we have our map data, and in the micro scale, we have our street data. So we're gonna probably be in groups if that's something that we want. Yeah.
And also, if I could add as well, there is a case study at the end of the article. If you feel that you wanted to go ahead and read that, you can. But we're just hoping that you get to 3/4 of it.
So the link to the article is in the chat there. And then as you are reading and you're finding out ideas, we also want to invite you to go back to the Jamboard that we were just on and just write down 3 important ideas that you've identified, 2 new insights, and perhaps one wondering about something that made you wondered and you wanted to sort of have a chat,
or even a curiosity that you wanted to explore in the next week or so within your learning space. And then when we come back, if we invite you to maybe share some of the insights or curiosities that the article brought up for you. And the article is by the author of the book, Shane Safir. And she does, so that's why we chose this particular one, because I know we don't have time to read this right now, but it gives you a good introduction to the text. Whenever you're ready, Isabella.
Okay, so we are going to be, you're going to be invited to go into a breakout room, and there should be 2 or 3 people in there. So again, introduce yourself, say hi, and take the time. So we are going to be in there for about 15 minutes. So we are set to go. And I'm just going to pause the recording just because if I go into different breakout rooms, it'll just record the breakout room session. Alrighty, welcome back. We hope that you've had some amazing conversations, or maybe not enough conversation. Make sure you bring that back to your work.
Isabella, did you make the transition slow and steady instead of like
No,
that.
it was just like,
Oh.
it was just shocking. Welcome to tech, the world of tech, I guess. Yeah, so as you are, we invite you to just unmute and share if you feel comfortable, or if not, just feel free to type into the chat as well. Aniel is going to just be recording some of the things that we've learned together. Yeah, feel free to share if there's anything that's come up, anything that's interesting.
We have Miss Mulcaster with her hand up.
I'm just going to talk about something Chris and I talked about a bit. And Chris, please, we had a very great dialogue, and it was cut off right at the end when he was talking. So I just want to say thank you, Chris. You're awesome. One of the questions you know, he really sparked for me is my son is in high school. And I'm thinking about, how do I build relationships with my elementary students versus in a high school learning environment? Because you may only see your learners for 75 minutes a day. And then I was thinking, if I asked my son, who is in high school this year, how well do you think your teachers know you? What might his answer be? And certainly if we talk about, you know, part of that street data is in that agency for our learners, you know, having them realize their identity, their efficacy, like they have to believe that A, that we believe in them, and that B, that they can do it. There were two more things I forgot, and I have a sticky note, but that was really a big question for me. I know as an elementary educator, I am in contact with my learners longer and am able to build those relationships. And certainly I think it can be done in secondary, but you have to be very purposeful and very intentional about how you go forward doing that. But that was just one of the things that we talked about that really resonated with me. I don't know if you want to add anything, Chris.
Yeah, I think that summed it up. I mean, the idea of time in class, and I think you brought up, Melanie, the Rotary versus the core class, and the differences in the relationships that you have, and how many touch points there are for students in certain programming environments. If they have, you know, a teacher and then an advisor and then a coach versus, you know, just a teacher, and what other opportunities do the full teaching faculty and support staff, you know, whoever, have these opportunities to interact with students, and whether they're sharing these things across different groups. Yeah, I'll mute now.
Thanks, Chris and Melanie. Okay, and feel free to, as we move forward, if you think of something, you can put it definitely in the Jamboard. I'm just mindful of the time. There is I think watching this video, it's 3 minutes. It kind of ties, you know, the article, and kind of gives us an intro to the book, if you're interested in reading that in all the time that I know that you don't have these days. We can just, I'm just going to play it. Isabella, give me a thumbs up if you are able to hear it. Oops.
That means you are this. And
Yep, we got sound.
Oops, sorry, 27.
In practice and what we do, it's a dramatic shift in mindset, right? And so we know that in many ways, the satellite sort of data system has reinforced deficit thinking, shaming, lagging, objectifying, and static. with this core stance, particularly directed toward students at the margins, towards our BIPOC students, of what's wrong with you, what's the gap, right? What's the gap that needs to be filled is kind of the implicit question all the time. And we're trying to reorient our thinking, our mindsets toward asset thinking, or what we sometimes call abundance thinking, right? Toward modes of assessment like project-based learning, like performance-based assessment, like reality pedagogy that showcase student genius, right? Toward data that's immediate and agentic, gives students a sense of agency and possibility and dynamic, right? And the ways that we can use it with this fundamental question of what's right with you, right? What's rich and beautiful and brilliant about you and your family and your community, and how do we anchor our teaching and learning in that? Back to you, Jamila.
So to make it concrete, I think about a student I had when I was a kindergarten teacher who was throwing chairs in my classroom. And I made a lot of assumptions at first about why he was throwing these chairs. As I got to learn more, I found out that he just had a brand new baby brother. And that baby brother was getting all the attention. He was really upset about that. That was his story. So important for me to tune into that lens, that street data. Artifacts, as I started to observe him in my block center, which is where he was happy, I got a chance to see him scribbling notes. I found out in the block center that he was figuring out how to make habitats for insects. That work from the block center he was in is an important artifact because it let me know this kid is into insects. Really, really important. As I started to do guided reading with him in the classroom, I now had his story about what was going on in the background in his life. I was able to capture some informal pieces of work from him. And in guided reading, I brought those two things together. When my principal came and observed me, this is where she saw my point of impact. Not in the data way later when he learned to read and did a fantastic job, but she paid very close attention to the way I was executing this reading instruction on a day-to-day basis. That is street data: story, artifacts, student work, and observation.
So with that video, we wanted to just sort of tie it back to our growing success document where we are talking about the triangulation of data. As teachers, we often have our products, but also we're kind of jumbling it with conversations and observations, but ultimately we're still trying to have that summative piece. We still have trying to have that like quantifying number that sort of like tells us, oh, this student is a 98 student or this student is a 90 student. But so in order for us to fill in those gaps, like what Jamila has said, we really need to be focusing on the stories, artifacts, and observations. And one thing that I think we wanted to sort of emphasize is that we want to just consider all of them holistically. For example, in our context, our administrator has just sort of like stopped in the hallway and just chatted with one of the students. And the student in that particular time was very stressed out because and then they just blurted out like, I'm really stressed out because I have a lot of homework. And then immediately in our school, like we have an email from admin that says like, you know, you need to watch out the amount of homework that you've been giving, just reiterating our homework policy. And that has just been one decision that's been made through one singular story, without the artifact and without the observation. Is it because of the quantity of the homework? No, it was with working with guidance, we found out it was merely an issue of organization and time management and trying to find out strategies for studying. But because of that assumption, because of that skewed implicit bias that the administrator had, we now have to completely change our way of teaching in our classroom to just minimize the amount of homework that our students have. And so just considering that same thing with our observation, conversation, and products, we also need to consider stories, artifacts, as well as observations.
So as we close, you know, the metaphor of the Google map going from satellite to street was something that I found to be really helpful for me to keep in perspective. Street data can be gathered by design or organically, as Isabella had also shared with us in her story. And there's a variety of ways. And this book has a ton of ways. I don't get any commission, I'm just telling you. But it was a book that was pivotal, I think, in my education journey. And anytime I can share things like that, I am very happy to do so. So from page 67, as Shane and Jamila say, street data humanizes the process of data gathering. And it engages people as subjects and agents in a shifting landscape. Human beings whose experiences are worthy of careful study and deep listening. Street data disrupts persistent deficit narratives. It centers student voices and strengths, and it provides a framework to build upon it. As Isabella mentioned before, data is messy. It should, it's not easy, but we do have access to it, and we're agents to make changes with it. So think of street data, even the authors say, think of it not as statisticians, but as ethnographers, as someone telling a story of a culture and of a community. So being able to pull the different pieces together to tell that story, to make that change, to transform the learning and to achieve outcomes. If you are curious, this great webinar, if you started at 2317 to 32, that's sort of a little introduction to the article that you read today. So it sort of summarizes the article and goes a little bit into depth. And this entire book really is founded on the shoulder, is founded on non-Western ways of thinking. So it really centers anti-colonial views. It centers Afrocentric views. It's based on, approaching education in terms of as an anti-racist educator. So we hope that you'll be able to join us next week. It's going to be a little bit more hands-on next week because what we're trying to think about is really, we don't want to disregard the satellite data that we have access to because it is data, it is rich, but how can we complement it? So I will be sharing some examples that, I had the privilege of working with some students with taking student census data and then really making meaning of it, reading level data and how, but also getting you to be messy and go on a task-oriented session with us where using Google Forms and Autocrat to really kind of, just tools to get us to explore that a little bit further. So we thank you for being with us today. It is 8 o'clock. Oh, wow, look at that. We also would really like your feedback. So if there's anything that you would provide us in terms of how we can change the session, how we can be more mindful of something else, we are always open to learning. Please do email us. We will take your feedback to heart. As Katina mentioned, there are prices. So I believe it's, I think Maureen and Mel have maybe won it in the past. I believe it's an Uber or Skip the Dishes gift card. I can't remember what it is. One of those. And so we have put all of your names into a random name picker. And I'm going to spin the wheel and then we'll see who the lucky winner is. Okay. Spin. Chris, it's you.
Chris,
Congratulations, Chris. I think what I need from you is your board email.
Yes.
Okay. And if you wanted to put it in the chat for me, if you feel comfortable, that would be fantastic. And again, I thank you all for being here with us and sharing this hour. And hopefully you can take something back. Hopefully we didn't talk too much. And hopefully you'll join us again next week to play a little bit. We thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Be well, everyone.
Thanks.
Chris, I'm going to wait for you to put your email in there.
I think I just sent it